Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I spoke with Denise. What if I told you she was one of 10 brothers and sisters? I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast, and thank you for your patience as I was doing various sound checks as I've got a few technical issues. But how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, David. And how are you?
I'm okay. Like I said to you, technical issues seem to be fixed, and as always, I'm baffled as to how they were fixed because I really just fumbled through it, and it seems to have corrected itself. But it's working. Yeah. As you know, we've done a couple of sound checks and everything's recorded. So, but like I said, I don't really know how it's fixed, and I don't really know how it went wrong in the first place. And my technical man Darren isn't available at the moment, so.
And I am in no position, so I do the same myself, fumble until it works.
Yeah, that's right, and it's carried me through several podcasts. So hopefully we'll get by the time we get to the end, it'll still sound as it does now, which will be useful. So just for reference, you live in Barbados, don't you?
I do live in Barbados, yes.
And how long have you been there, roughly? Or always lived there?
I was born in Trinidad, and I grew up there. I lived there until I was in my early 20s. And then I came to Barbados to go to university. I ended up getting married and living here. So I've been here for about 40 years, or just over, and just over 40 years.
Over 40 years?
Yeah.
Crikey, it's. But you were in Trinidad originally, is that correct?
Yes, that's where I was born. That's where I was raised, and I still go back quite often because it's not very far away, and I still have family there and friends and so on.
Is that when you say it's not far away? Is that just a small local plane or?
Yeah, small local plane, 1 hour.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So is that like one of those like I refer to them as like island hopper planes? They're just like a couple of propellers and a few seats.
Propellers, yeah. No, this actually has about 40 seats.
Yeah.
Something like that, 40-50 seats.
So like bus size.
Yeah.
So it's almost like an island bus, isn't it? Just hops over.
Yeah, it's reasonably comfortable and reasonably reliable in terms of time and service and so on. So it's good.
Yeah, that's good though, isn't it? If it's only an hour, that's kind of no trouble at all. It's barely, you know what I mean? It's barely travelling if it's only an hour.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know. Yeah. What were you studying when you was at university?
I studied languages, French and Spanish, languages and literature. So, it's a 3-year program. I hesitated a bit before, so I worked as a flight attendant when I first left school after my A-levels. My dad died suddenly, and plans for university were sort of up in the air, and I decided, no, I'd like to work. So, to my surprise, I managed to get a job as a flight attendant with the former version of the airline that now does the island hopping.
Okay.
It used to be EWI, it's now called Caribbean Airlines. And I managed to get a job there, and I worked there for a few years. And then I lived in France for a year with a French family. And then I decided that if this is what I love, this is what I'll study. Because all along there were other ideas of, well, what do you do with a degree in languages? And I said, well, I'll see. And then I decided to go for it. And I ended up teaching at the university, actually, when I was finished. So I spent about 9 years teaching there afterwards. So it ended up being my career for a bit, languages.
Nice. So how do we get from university to writing a book?
Well, let's see that. When I told my brother that I had written a book and it was going to be published. He says, finally. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, when you were a little thing, you'd walk around the house telling everyone you were going to be an authoress. And if they said an author, you would say, no, an authoress, like Enid Blyton. Because I wanted to make the point that I was going to be a female writer. I have no recollection of that. I do know that I did write little stories and poems and stuff all through primary school, all through secondary school or high school. So I was always writing. And so when I studied languages and literature, and I actually taught literature for a while, I always knew it was what I would be doing. It was just a question of when. And I did law as well. When I left languages, it was because I decided to move out of that area, do law. And, well, if you ever want to be an observer of human experience, that would be the place. So I'm not saying I derive anything because it's all confidential and so on, but just observing people and getting an idea and then relating things back to your family. Oh, right. Yes, I had a brother who was like that. And you begin to think for that. Yeah.
A friend of mine. Sorry, I was just going to say, you said about law. I didn't mean to cut you off. I do apologise, but it just, a friend of mine, Lewis, we're still friends. We went to college together, and I met up with him recently. We were talking about when we used to have free periods at college, we used to go to the local magistrates court because they had a public gallery and you could watch all the court cases. And you're exactly right. And I always tell people, never be surprised by people's behaviour.
It's true. And sometimes the contrast between the person that sits in front of you, tears in their eyes, telling you a story, and then what comes out, what they leave out, what they exclude, and that hits you afterwards, and you have to, it's really quite surprising.
It is, and people will sit there bawling their eyes out, telling you they're a victim. And then when you kind of uncover a few things, I've seen people go from bubbling, like just bawling their eyes out, and you can't help but have the most amount of empathy for them. And it's so tragic, it's so horrible. And then you find out it's all a lie, and they were the perpetrator, and they go literally from a crying, helpless victim to stone cold, not a care in the world. And you're like, wow. And the thing that always terrifies me about that is you want to believe that you can read people, that you know people. And every time I've seen that happen, you realise, like, oh, no, you're still quite naive. There is no certainty in people.
Yeah. And it's just the little things they leave out which can kind of turn things. So even if they're not the perpetrator, they are, in fact, they contributed to where they are. But I guess none of us see ourselves as being, some of us do, but none of us see ourselves as being totally responsible. So something happens and people would come and tell you, oh, with this, I trusted him, and I don't know what I was thinking, and until you realize that they were actually in collusion up to a point where someone got the upper hand, and then this person comes crying victim. Or sometimes people simply don't understand or remember the impact of everything that they have done. So after a couple of years, I used to say to people, I'm really sorry you had this experience, but don't leave out. Please, let's go over this again. Don't exclude anything. Try to remember everything. I don't like surprises.
Yeah.
So after you get an idea, and when sometimes you read what has been said to you, and you get a sense that there's missing material. So then you learn how to mine people for their material that they're not revealing, and so on.
It's funny though, some of the most innocent looking characters where you think butter wouldn't melt in their mouth can have some really dark secrets. But I will say, sometimes you read what people have been through, and that they still got kindness in their heart.
Yes, it's true. It's very true. Yeah.
you know.
So that's a silver lining, that there are quite a few people like that
Mm,
that come to you. There's the other end of it as well. They come to you smiling and seeming cheerful, and when they start going into the details of what they've experienced, you're surprised because you would be on the floor weeping if you were
yeah,
them. They have faith, and I think that's the big thing. They have faith. Yeah,
it's
and like
interesting because I've met people over the years where when they start telling you their story, you just like start trying to pick apart like how they're even okay, and then afterwards when they sort of like say, look, any help you can give me, thank you, and they're so generous in their gratitude, and you like, crikey, if anybody on this planet deserves a bit of luck or a bit of help right now, is you. But they're like, I don't want to trouble you, I don't want to bother you, and you're like, no, it's literally my job. Let me do this for
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. It's true. It's true. And especially in business relations. Well, I did lots of family law, and I would see that after a while, I began to understand the dynamic. It's there's a lot of emotional pain,
Mm,
and people are inclined to use the process to kind of address that pain. So I would say to people, I can deal with the legal end, but you need to deal with it. Go to a therapist or however
yeah,
you do it, go whatever. But invariably, that would become part of it. But also people in business, you would see people going into business together, and it was a great idea, and they were all really enthusiastic and then they trusted their business partner until really, the audit was done or something. Then they realized, hang on, um, I ought to be getting a bigger check,
mm,
and so forth. So it's really, I mean, but you see as much of that as you see as much of people, as you say, who are really just trying to get on with life and who are optimistic and truthful and so on. And so, it takes you to a place where you begin to observe human behavior and to take a look at the process that we have chosen. As I mean, most societies have legal systems. The process we have chosen to deal with these things, and it makes for interesting thinking. So when the pandemic came, and I found myself, the world sort of disappeared, and I found myself, because Barbados was really strict about it in the first few months, and I found myself with time and space, and my phone wasn't ringing so much, and so on. I thought, well, this is it. I'm gonna sit and write this book. And I realized after that I had written pieces of it before. So in a way, it's a book I've been writing for a while.
yeah.
And it took off from there. It just sort of carried itself. I have to say, I did not find myself sitting at the computer with nothing to write. And if that happened, I just put it away and carry on with something else. And then I'd have a thought, or I'd hear something from someone, or I'd see something, and I'd think, oh yeah, right. And that would send me off back to it. So that's how you get from teaching languages and literatures to law to writing a book.
And what's the kind of synopsis of the book?
The synopsis of the book. That's always an interesting question. Just in a very basic form, it starts out, the name of it is Talent Show, of course. So the father, if you like, is the first one that grabs the microphone. And he's a quiet man in his life, but now he's passed on. So if you can suspend whatever beliefs you have or don't have and accept that he's talking to you now from a place where he can finally be as talkative as he wanted to be, whereas in his life he wasn't. And he begins to tell the story of his courtship of his wife, they're getting married, having children, and so on. So on another level, it's a family story, but on another level, it's a love story, because he reveals quite openly some of what he learns about his wife in the course of the marriage. And I guess a little bit of what she learned about him and a little bit of what she may not have learned about him or known about him. And he seems to be speaking to his children. So he's like saying, hang on, you see us guys as parents, okay? I'm dad, she was mom. But this is who we were before. This is who we became with the birth of each child. This is who we became. These are the changes that happened just because we were parents. And this is how we managed it. And this is what I learned about your mother, and you may not have known. You may have seen this object in our bedroom and not understood why it was always there, prominently displayed on the chest, because, and so there's a lot of that. The second part of the book, the children respond. And you begin to realize that, okay, parents have a view of their children, but they don't know everything that goes on in the kids' lives. And so they have a view of them, and they may know things about them, but they don't know sometimes what they call these days the backstory of it. And children share secrets and so on. And in the very last part, it goes back to the ancestors, the father of the wife, who we get to see a piece of. We've learned about him through the book, through the husband talking about him and so on. And then he's very brutally honest about the person that he was. And then you have a couple of others, someone from the current generation speaking about his discovery of what his family was and where they were from and so on. And in the backdrop of all of that, we all love chocolate, I assume. And the backdrop of all of that is a little bit of the cocoa culture, because in Trinidad, it was a big part of the economy for a very long time. And it's now had a resurgence. It kind of dipped a bit when we discovered oil reserves in Trinidad, and people thought, that's easier than growing stuff. There was also a disease that swept through the Caribbean called witch broom, and that sort of did in some of the cocoa. But now it's having a huge resurgence. So some of that is in talent show as well. That's one of the backgrounds of the book. It's a sort of family background, because the wife comes out of that cocoa culture. And the guy at the end going into it and is shocked to discover that his family had anything to do with it.
So what is the cocoa culture?
The cocoa culture is that, Trinidad was colonized initially by the Spanish. And then at a point in time, it was the terrain of the country, the island, is so challenging that they couldn't really properly colonize or handle it or anything. And so at a point in time, they made an invitation to all Catholics from Europe who wanted to come to grow cocoa. And so lots of French people came, because it coincided with the Haitian Revolution and other things that were going on in France and so on. And people were just in those days willing to go out to seek their fortune. That was the fact of it. So cocoa culture centered around what were called the French Creoles and what they call the cocoa panols, which were Espanol, cocoa panols. Some people shorten it now to say cocoa payol. And so it was a very close culture in some ways. They grew the cocoa, they hired people, and they were very faithful to that culture. They spoke a language among themselves, which then spread to all of Trinidad, because when the British got Trinidad towards the end of the 18th century, no one spoke English, so it was quite a thing. So the cocoa culture, it's about very traditional family values. It's about a language. It's about a way of raising girls, a way of raising boys. It's about a woman's place in society, the prominence of the church, and things of that nature. So it's a whole slice of life, if you like. And well, now it's been integrated. When I was a teenager, it was integrated, so that I was aware that I had family who were originally from that culture, and I was aware of the difference. But when I went to school, people didn't know about it because by then, they at a point they married each other and remained intact. But after a while, they began to be integrated into the wider population and so on. So by the time I was at school, people had names that would tell you that they were from that heritage, but their father would have married someone who was not.
Yeah.
So it became integrated. So they were perhaps not so aware of the differences. But I certainly remember thinking to myself, how come my cousins that live out in the country have such a different life? And, and no one even knows about it, and so on. So in many ways, it was a beautiful culture. Some of it still remains. There are traditional songs that are sung at Christmas time in Spanish. They're called parang. And that's still very much in a particular area in Trinidad, in the east of Trinidad. So it's quite a piece of what Trinidad has become, even if people aren't aware of it.
I think that's something that is difficult with this kind of globalization of the internet, which enables you and I to talk. We don't understand our own neighbours, but we kind of like to think we do. And I often say on here when I talk about my culture, because I was born in England, but my mum is from Ireland. And she's from Southern Ireland, and I always refer to my mum, but I'm actually referencing my nan, her mum, who emigrated over here with my granddad. I always refer to them as Southern Irish Catholics because it's a particular type of culture. And the Catholics, when I used to go to church as a child in England, were not the same Catholics that I went to church with when I was in Ireland. And when I think of my nan and her sisters and her uncles and how they practiced their faith and what being a Catholic was to them, it wasn't the same as being a Catholic in England, at the churches in England. It was completely different. But it was all about Jesus, of course. It was all about God, of course it was. It was all on a Sunday. Yeah. But they had a very... I can't explain it, but I can give you certain mannerisms and stuff like that. But they really were tuned into whatever happened in their life, God's will.
Yes.
And it wasn't questioned. Wasn't questioned.
Yeah, correct. And that's a part of talent show as well. The father's sort of stoicism and his way of handling things like the death of a child and stuff like that. It's God's will.
I have as soon as you said that, there's two aunts that spring to mind because both of them lost children. One of them lost 3 children, I think, but unfortunately lost 2 of them as adults. But every time, God's will. As heartbroken as she was, and is as heartbroken as any mother that's lost a child. Do you know what I mean? I'm in no position to explain that experience to a person that's lost a child. There was something that when she said it, and you heard this, it's God's will, and you just like, okay, I don't. It sounds really clumsy, and I don't mean it to, but I never knew what I was supposed to do with that, because they were absolutely heartbroken. Her heart had been ripped out so many times from losing children, but because it was God's will, there was kind of no bitterness or anger about it, just heartache because I missed my child. But that's the decision, so that must be a blessing even if it hurts. And my lesson from this is to understand that that's what God wanted.
I recognize that. That's very much the culture I was raised in.
Yeah.
Catholic culture, it was all about God's will. And
But
when
I never saw that culture in England, going to church.
never. Okay, yeah, I did see it in very much in Trinidad. It was very much what you ran to or what you touched on when tragedy struck.
Yeah.
I've seen. I mean, there's one family I can think of, and talent show it's a bit about my family, but it's also about. It's like a mixture of my cousins, neighbors, people in the neighborhood, our family. So it's like an alternate version, if you like, of my family. But I've seen people. I remember one family who had a fire, and they lost everything, including a child that they thought was out of the house and wasn't. And I remember being so struck by it. I would have nightmares about it, and ask my parents if this was going to happen to us, and they would say, no, 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 no. And that God took that child because it was God's will. And I remember observing the family, even the children at school and so on. And, the neighborhood came together and supported them, and it was very beautiful. But I remember thinking to myself, if I don't know how I would even wake up and yet they went through this tragedy in that manner, still going to church, saying it was God's will and so on. So it was very much a part of that local culture as well, to sort of religion was a big part of it. And the father in the story, for example, was not Catholic, but he converted because he was marrying into this big Catholic family. And then eventually, you know what they say about people who convert, they actually become more pious than
the most devout, yeah.
And the father in the book is definitely very devout and so on. So it's an interesting, thought about human beings. I mean, even if you don't put God, I think faith in something, in yourself, in just life, is what takes us through. And it certainly is what took the family through.
I've always had this strange relationship with Catholicism and faith, because on so many levels I've seen people who are just devoted to it and devout in their belief. They deal with life better than I've ever dealt with it. But you can't force yourself into believing in something the way that they did, like the way that my grandparents did and that family. But it really was something that made them count their blessings. It was just automatic, and they didn't, when life was tough for them, when they were going through problems, they literally would just look to the sky and God will give me the strength I need for this moment. And that in itself, just that acknowledgement that they were going to be okay and they were strong enough because God or Jesus was by their side, it took them through it. But they also had this discipline of purpose that when you get up in the morning, you do what you need to do, and you're grateful for that at the end of the day. And I honestly, it's a little complicated in so many ways, but I think it's one of the biggest things missing from people's lives today. It's just that faith in something that is beyond them.
Yes, it's true. It's true. And yeah, it's true, because I mean, life is a little bit like Zoom. It's inexplicable, really. Things crop up and you can't really understand or find a solution right away, but you keep trying and things work out, and and you move on and so on. And I'm aware that people go through very long patches of things not working out, but somehow at the end of it, they find a solution, or they accept whatever happens. And I think that acceptance is a big part of it as well.
Yeah.
Just accepting it's not always going to be a bed of roses. I think we went through a period, I remember in the 1990s and early 2000s, where we had a belief that we could make it all just be great and have no negative aspects. But I think the experiences of the world have shown us since then that, yeah, things are just going to happen that we have no control over. And when you have no control over what's happening, yes, you can be angry. Yes, you can lose faith and so on. But ultimately, the only way through it, the only way on the other side of it is through it. It's like, that storm out at sea, you just have to go through the storm. So it's a belief. A sailor, I talked to a guy once who sailed yachts, luxury yachts down the Caribbean, because very wealthy folk don't actually, they fly and they hire people to bring the yacht down and so on. And I said to him, because I live on an island and I swim and I love the sea, but I don't much like going out there to see what the ocean would show me. I'm not, That's not my. And I said to him, how do you do it? And he said, well, when it rears up in front of you, you pick a path and you know that the only way out of it is through it. And you just go. And I think that's very much sort of how we all get through life, I think. Whatever that path is, it's how you get to the other side of it.
And that probably is an excellent philosophy, because when you look at it from that perspective, that when you're going through a storm, you have to just pick a path, and that's how we're going to get through this. And the people that, pun intended, but get sunk are the ones that are indecisive, constantly trying to change direction, finding like there's some shortcut to get out of this. No, there isn't. The storm is there, and you've got to find a way through, and that way is to just be determined in the direction you're going, being aware that you might get blown off course, but then you have to just pick another course, and right, this is how we're getting through the storm.
When that happens, when you hit something within the storm that is itself another little storm, you have to find your way out of it. So I think as humans, we are really very resilient. We don't always know it or show it. I think we are quite resilient, most of us.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think one of the things I've probably learned a lot from doing these podcasts is people are incredibly resilient, but the more comfortable we get, the more we forget how resilient we can be. And life if you listen to people today, they will tell you how hard life is and how impossible it is and how difficult their life is. And you just like, we've never had it so good. It's the best time it's ever been to be alive.
Yeah, correct.
But people are absolutely convinced that it's the worst time ever been alive in history. And you're just like, you need to pick up some history books and read what history is.
It were the Dark Ages, yes, definitely.
Yeah, but also kind of, you made a really good point about the French when they started coming over to the Caribbean. They were just people who were part of a revolution who were trying to find their own way. It wasn't some personal vendetta. The world was expanding. People were discovering countries and islands that nobody ever knew about. And it's interesting when you look at the history of Europe. It's never been at peace. It's been at war for as long as we've been recording history. It's always at war, and we've had a few moments where they've enjoyed peace, but they're very limited. And when there was a thing called the 100-Year War, and I think it was actually 107 years long. I think it was 100. Yeah. And it's just like, how many generations of people kept that fight going?
to even visualize it, to even contemplate that.
Yeah.
Where do you get troops from, and how do you keep that going? Do you take a day off?
Yeah. and if you grew up in the French Revolution, and in and around the time of the 100-Year War, you'd have heard those stories. All you'd have known about is Napoleon and all of this, And somebody says, we found these new islands, and here's a boat. If you've got the money for a ticket, you'll be a free man. Nobody's ever going to conscript you again. You know.
There's a piece of land that will be yours.
Yeah.
And you just have to be willing to grow the cocoa. And I mean, it brought groves,
Yeah. What do you have to, you can imagine somebody saying, like, what do I have to do? And you just have to get on the boat.
Yeah, exactly.
Get on the boat. We'll take you there.
Yeah. My own mother's family, for example, her grandmother never spoke English. She came from Martinique down to Trinidad. But my mother's father's family was out of the Spanish side. So in that household, they spoke French patois. They had Spanish expressions and grandparents who never spoke English. And it was all out of a sense of, let's just go see what goes on there. And Trinidad is a very interesting example of that, because there is a population of Portuguese heritage in Trinidad as well. And they were the ones, I think Portuguese were always seafaring people.
Yeah.
After the discovery. And at some point in time, they came out, and we have people with Portuguese family names in Trinidad. And when I went to Portugal, I was saying, my goodness, I didn't, you know about it, they're Portuguese, but you don't think about it. And a lady told me once that she went back to Portugal to trace her roots, because when she got there, she discovered she had a very prominent Portuguese name, very wealthy people. But when she checked it, it wasn't likely that her ancestor actually came from that family. And he may have given that name when he got on board, thinking that it was a name of prosperity. So, you have all these wonderful stories of that type of thing that happen in the world. So when we are where we are today, and people left behind families,
knowing I'd never see you again.
And now, my daughter lives in Canada, and we talk 3-4 times a week. If there's something amusing, she'll send me a WhatsApp, or I'll send it to her. And you think to yourself, I said to her one day, do you know when people first started going to Canada from the Caribbean to migrate to Canada? There was no turning back. There was no, I don't like this, so I'll just go back. No, they went on a boat to England, they went on a boat to Canada, and so on. And that was it. That was to be their life. And it was only when, air travel became available that people now can say, all right, yes, I have cousins in Trinidad, and so on. But before that, it was... So we actually have a pretty good life. I mean, it has its own challenges, of course.
Yeah, of course it does, yeah. But like you said, it's once upon a time, when somebody from Trinidad emigrated to Canada, when they knew they were never seeing their parents again, their brothers or sisters, they knew that they would be lucky if... You would actually consider yourself grateful if a year later you got a letter from them saying, I arrived.
Correct, yeah. And phone calls were for Christmas time, where I'm thinking they probably had to go to some special location.
Yeah.
And make that phone call, and there'd be all the crackling on the line, and I can't hear you, and people would shout. My own parents, at a point in time, we'd say to them, no, well, they're calling from overseas. Why are you shouting? They'd say, they're calling from overseas. And we'd say, yeah, but you can hear them. Because they grew up in an era when someone...
I remember that.
Have to really shout to be heard, and so on. So it's interesting just seeing generations.
Because my nan, the one from Ireland, her brothers... She had some brothers that went to Sydney, and I'm pretty sure it was a 6-week boat trip, and there were 2 groups of brothers that went, but they weren't able, I don't know the reasons why, but they didn't go together. And so 2 or 3 brothers went off on this boat to Sydney. At some point in time, the other two or 3 brothers got on a boat to Sydney, and Josie, he's no longer around. He wrote a book called A Trip to Nowhere Special or something, and he talks about how they were walking down the high street in Sydney, and because of obviously you couldn't write letters to people, nobody knew, like they didn't know where they were. The other brothers didn't know they were coming over, and they're literally walking down the high street and they bump into each other.
Oh, wow.
So,
yeah.
Because that was how you discover, because a 6-week boat trip, by the time you've gone over there 6 weeks, by the time you've written a letter to say I've arrived, that's 6 weeks to get back. Well, in that 6 weeks you've probably got a job and moved.
Exactly, yes.
And you're starting to talk about 12 weeks, 18 weeks, 24 weeks. Well, now we're moving closer to 6 months. Well, another lot of brothers, a letter could literally arrive saying this isn't working out, we're on our way back, and your brothers are halfway to Sydney on a boat.
Yeah.
and you won't discover that until you get there, and it would be 6 months in a letter before that you find out. And I had an interesting podcast with a lady who's, I think it was her father or her grandfather, I can't remember. He was originally emigrated from England to South Africa, but when they got to South Africa there was dysentery or something on the boat, so they weren't allowed in port. So his whole family were thinking that he was going to South Africa. When they got to South Africa, he couldn't disembark, and the boat was then carrying on to Australia. So he went from England to South Africa to Australia, gets to Australia, and they're literally like, he just gets off the boat, walks up to whoever was in Australia, and is like, I'm actually supposed to be in South Africa, but I've ended up here. Any chance anybody's got a job? And like his whole family, it was probably 2 years or something before his family even knew where he was, if he was alive. And that was just life. That's, everybody accepted it.
Yes.
And today we get annoyed if somebody doesn't reply within an hour to a text message.
Exactly. Yeah. It shows you. My own father, his father was from England and came here with his brother. And they didn't come to Trinidad, they came to Barbados, which was what I discovered after I came here. And I said to an old aunt that I was now living in Barbados, and she said, "Oh, do you know that's where we were from?" But at some point in time, when my grandfather married my grandmother, my grandmother's family didn't like it. And so they just moved to Trinidad with whichever of the children. I think my father was actually born here, and his sister and the others were born in Trinidad. So it's like people just moved around a lot. And I never knew that until I said that to her, and she said, "Oh," and I said, "Okay." But when I checked it, there was no one left, because some of them went back to England and some went to other countries and so on. So it's fascinating.
It's crazy when we look at it from that perspective, right? Like today, we're terrified of going anywhere outside of our home range, whereas back then, when there was no guarantees, no communication, no support, people just, I've got an idea, I'm going to get on a boat. Where are you going? I don't know, some country called Australia, some country called Trinidad. It takes 8 weeks to get there. I'm sure it'll be fine. And because that's how the world was. Is in some respects, everybody was an entrepreneur.
Yes. And in talent show, there's actually a little bit of that, because the father talks about his brother, who suddenly heard that there was money to be made in Venezuela, working in the oil fields, and went off, made money. Not much contact, sent money to Trinidad for his mother every so often, who then bought a property for him, and so many years later he's back with a wife and a child and so on. And so that's the way it went. It was like, you looked around and decided where you could go, and people were so open to it. As you say, now it's a different story.
Do you have any plans to write any more books?
I am writing the second book. I'm almost finished, actually. my second book. It should go to the editor by the end of next week. And yeah, I have notes for a third. So,
And
yeah.
is this a trilogy or 3 separate books?
Oh, it's 3 separate books. 3 separate books. They're not really connected.
No. Are you still covering like the human interactions of people?
Yes, that's my focus. That's my interest, and that's what I think. It's what gets me writing.
Yeah. Because it must have been, going back to when you were doing law and stuff, it must have been interesting when you, I suppose some days would be disheartening and other days would be inspiring, where one, you probably turn up to work one day and see the betrayal between families, but then other days see the loyalty and love between families.
Right, quite so. And I think that's why there's this other theme of talent show that's about the need to be seen and heard. And I think that's why, the name is talent show, because in a family, as in the world, I think we all try to be seen and heard. And so you would see a lot of that. I would see a lot of that. People, 2 brothers who were at war. And what was it? Well, it was because he was always the one that got all the attention. He was the one who was popular with the girls or whatever. He's the one who was the sports person. I was overlooked. And so here I am now. And, well, I want to run the company, not him. And, well, to take orders from me. But it's really about a very human need that we have to be seen as ourselves and to be appreciated for what we are. And so I'd see a lot of that, yeah. And when you can see that, I guess I was a bit of a different lawyer, because when I can see that, I would try to take that angle in my conversations with the client, to maybe get them to understand that, well, this is not really an attack on you. This is really about where you guys came from in the family context.
Yeah.
And just maybe try.
It is amazing how many people grow up as adults, but when it comes to their parents, they really do resent what they consider their parents' unfair treatment. And sometimes maybe it was unfair, but often parents were just doing the best they could with what they had during the day. Just like, it's not as personal as you think it is. But, maybe mum and dad were knackered after 40 hours a week work. Maybe they were struggling with bills. Maybe they weren't the most equipped and were aware they weren't the most equipped and were just trying to do the best they could.
Yeah. Because we have an assumption that people, I think today we have more control over the process of becoming a parent. But back in the day, we had an assumption that everyone who were parents were suited to that particular path in life, whereas it really wasn't so. Some people went along with it societally because this was what happened. You grew up, you had kids, whatever, but would often find themselves not particularly suited to it.
No.
So they just did the good.
That's it. And I think as well as especially now, I think we look back and we forget things like our parents grew up in an era where it's just simple things like if you got sacked just because you could get sacked because your boss didn't like the look of you because he was having a bad day, and you'd be aware of that, and you might have to suck up an awful lot of crap during the day to keep a job, and then you come home and you've got a son or a daughter complaining because they don't like the food on the plate, and you've no idea how shit my day has been, and you're complaining because you didn't want fish fingers and beans tonight. Do you think I want fish fingers and beans?
Oh, yeah. You come home and there's one kid who's always, there's always one who's more vocal than the other.
Yeah.
So one kid that's vocal, and it just seems to the parent that there this kid goes again whining and so on. And I don't think also that parents were as conscious as they might be today as to what might be behind that whining. And I think now as parents we are kind of called on to say, okay, why is she always whining? Why is he always whining? What's the real story here? And maybe sit with the kid and get an idea of how was your day, how was school, and then, realize that there's someone at school who may be bullying them
Yeah.
or something. But back in the day, that was not the norm. It was like, you did your best as a parent, and
life was hard. Life was hard back in the day. People, there wasn't the. It's very difficult to explain to somebody that, you don't have to go back that far. That if you, look, we're out trying to over personalize it, and you said your dad died when you were young, and you were like, well, can I go to university? Do I get a job? What do I do? Because there was nobody there picking up pieces for you. There was no social side of the government that was just like, this must be really terrible for you. I wonder if we can help you. People were just like, yeah, guess what? We've got problems. You've got yours.
If you want to go to university, you've got to work.
Yeah. And today people they would be like, oh yeah, but it's not fair because they've lost their dad. Was going back to when that happened to you, I'm sure everybody had sympathy, but nobody was handing anything out to you.
So I was faced with choices, and I picked the one that, when you're that age, it seems, oh, okay, I get to travel, I get to fly, I get to be in different places. Sure, I'll give it a go. Of course, 2.5 years later, I happily left because I discovered that was not what I wanted in life.
Yeah.
So you just really experience life. You found yourself and experienced life by force because that was what you did. There was never, someone gets sacked today, they can find legal aid and they can take to court and all of this.
Yeah.
I did this before. So there was, as you say, there was that pressure to just really go along with a lot of things on the job that were not that great. But, progress has been made in that respect. So now people have rights and their employment rights and all of that and so on. So, yeah.
And, and it's I think people are really bad at trying to put themselves in a position of what life was like once upon a time. Compare it, and when we compare it to today, it's like, myself included, I'll finish this, in a couple of hours I'll be talking to somebody and I'll be moaning about something, completely forgetting I've just had this great conversation with somebody about life used to be really difficult. And if I think back to when I was a kid, I can remember how difficult that was. But,
And in talent show, they have the family, they're 10 children. I mean, people struggle with 2. Yeah. I have 2 children, grown children, adult. When I thought of families like this, my own family, which was also numerous, and my cousins, and I wondered, how on earth did it happen? How did they even do it?
How many brothers and sisters did you have? How many was there?
I actually had 4 brothers and 5 sisters.
Yeah.
So not unlike talent show. But we're not exact representations of talent show. Yeah. And so, it was about, if you were outside playing and you fell, there was no coming inside to cry and have someone kiss it and make it better. You looked after it yourself. You were told by someone, maybe an older brother or sister, this is what you do, and so on. And so on. Of course, severe fracture or something would come to your parents' attention. But so even trying to get my kids to understand what it was like to grow up in that family. I mean, they lose track of my siblings sometimes. What order was this one? Was that the oldest? But then the benefit of it is that they have so many cousins. Yeah. And in today's world, all on Facebook, on a family group, and they plan holidays and see each other and stuff like that. So it becomes a blessing to them, something that they really cherish in their lives. All these cousins of different types, and some crazy ones, and some entertaining, less so. So,
but it's interesting because how do your parents cope with 10 children? That's a lot of demands.
I don't know, and I was the last. So
So
my view is looking up,
you're the youngest.
yeah, looking at the pipeline and looking at some of my older siblings and seeing the various ways in which adult life can be experienced, because the older ones were adults when I was a child. And then looking at the adolescents and at my parents and so on. But it wasn't that unusual
No.
in my neighborhood or in even my cousins. I think my mother's sister had 8 children and so on. So it was, it was sort of the thing. If you said a party and it was just family, you knew you were talking about 40 people right away.
And that's the immediate family, like off the immediate roster roll.
Yes, immediate family. And so my parents dealt with it. They were very religious. I don't happen to be, but they were very religious, and that was their sort of framework. They went off to mass every Sunday. My father prayed every day, and so on. And it was always that sort of approach. And then they had their fun, and we knew when they went out to have their fun, we'd have our fun at home, house to yourself, and so on, and so on. So that's just how it's just one day after another.
Yeah, it is. You don't know any different, so it's kind of.
So,
Just quickly to finish up, where can people find you and your book?
you can find me. I do have a website. It's denisehainesauthor.com, not authoress. denisehainesauthor.com. They can find my book on Kindle, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, and the audiobook has just come out on Audible.
Oh, nice. Well done.
Yeah.
And just lastly, a random question that I just enjoy asking. If you could go, imagine you have a time machine. The time machine is a car. So you can go anywhere in history that you want to go. Why would you go there? Where would you go? What would the car be? And what music would be on the radio?
Well, I think I would say that, and it's maybe going back to my own lifetime, it seemed that we had a really hard time on planet Earth in the 20th century. You had the Depression and the wars and all of that. But I seem to have a memory of the late 60s, early 70s. Late 60s and 70s, let's say. As a time when things were changing, people were beginning to come out of a rigid way of living and to be more interested in expressing themselves and accepting others as being themselves. And what would be on the radio? Probably Stevie Wonder.
Nice.
Yeah. Anything by Stevie Wonder.
And what would the car be?
Oh, the car. That would be a Volkswagen for sure. A Beetle.
Nice. That's brilliant. Denise, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's been great. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And there you have it. And it's funny, isn't it? Life, the dynamics of life, what people used to be prepared to do compared to the things we complain about today. I'm not sure if we're moving forwards or going backwards. But family dynamics appear to be the same regardless of the century. And some people can and some people just won't. But Denise was lovely. Please do check out the website, check out her book. And as always, thank you for watching, listening, subscribing. Thank you for the comments. I do appreciate them. And please, wherever you are from, whatever you believe, do take care and be blessed. Thank you.